on the processed versus unprocessed side, try to be on the unprocessed side. And once again, this is a spectrum. I mean, to a certain degree, everything is processed. You cooking your steak is processed.
Right.
You cutting up an apple is technically processed. So ultimately, it's kind of figuring out, hey, for each individual ingredient, what is kind of the ideal state? And then, how do we get close to that perspective?
Welcome to the HVMN podcast, your resource for evidence-based nutritional strategies, cognitive performance, and fitness science. Thank you for joining us. Meal replacements. It's an arm of the food industry that has exploded in the last few years. As more and more of us are on the go or trying to maximize office productivity, quick and easy nutrition has climbed higher in demand. The problem is, most of these products are not exactly what we would call healthy. This week, our guest is Connor Young, founder and CEO of Ample. Ample aims to be that healthy meal replacement with specific products targeting ketogenic, vegetarian, or more standard diet lifestyles. Elephant in the room, yes, it is processed food. Yes, the ingredients in Ample are probably better to eat in its whole food state. There are pros and cons to processed foods, meal replacements, etc. Connor himself preaches how we should be eating more whole foods, so it was interesting exploring how he believes his company fits in the health food industry, how and why they formulate certain ingredients like pea protein, and the state of personalized nutrition as a whole. We ask the hard questions you probably want to ask Connor yourself, so get ready. If, by the end of the episode, you find yourself curious to try Ample, Connor was kind enough to offer our listeners 15% off your first purchase. Just use the code HVMN. Their website is www.amplemeal.com. You can also find these details in the show notes. Enjoy the episode.
Connor, thanks for coming on to the program.
Jeff, so thankful to be here, and I appreciate you having me on.
So we probably met now 4 years ago now. At a WeWork in San Francisco when we were both just starting off on our companies. So HVMN was known as NutriBox at the time. And I think we were a little bit ahead of you at the time. Maybe we had 3-4 employees, and this young dynamic man, Connor Young, came into the WeWork and was very fit, talking about changing nutrition. And fast forward 3-4 years, and now that company is Ample. So very cool to see this journey.
Yeah, it's been fun also to see how not only you guys how we both have evolved throughout that time, but also like how the entire industry has evolved throughout that time. It's been like really fascinating to see.
Maybe we should start with just painting the landscape of what nutrition, what health and wellness sort of seemed like as an industry and as a community 3-4 years ago.
Sure. I'm 30 years old right now. I graduated from college probably around 8 years ago. And I started a CrossFit gym, and that was in Nashville, Tennessee. So I did this CrossFit gym, and then kind of was like, oh, well, this is really cool and exciting, but also like it's not scalable. Like I wanted to see like how could you scale that? But I also wanted to see what the deal was with the medical industry, because obviously like where we are from a health perspective, I thought was one of the biggest challenges of our generation. Like, how do we get people healthier? So that's kind of what I set out to do, which is to just be in the business of health. Sold medical devices for a couple of years for Johnson & Johnson, but I kind of realized that it was very reactive. We weren't really, from an industry, we weren't really trying to solve people's problems. We were trying to kind of sell them expensive Band-Aids.
Yeah.
So came out to San Francisco and started a physical therapy patient engagement platform. And so that was around the time when actually another competitor came out, and as I was starting this other company, kind of realized most of my friends had this issue with eating healthily, and they were like, well, okay, you can tell me how to eat, and that's fine, but I actually don't have the time to actually be able to do that on a routine basis. So like, although it's knowing what to do is important, really being able to have the tools, that's probably just as important. So they were like, hey, can you make something for me? Can you basically make a really quick meal, but that's also healthy? And that's when I was like, all right, fine, I'll give it a try. And so it was kind of this concept of Ample was effectively thrust upon me from my friends, which is actually in hindsight a fantastic way to start a business when the demand was already inherent. But where I was kind of coming from, and the reason why I was not happy with the industry at the time was because it felt like the vast majority of the food industry especially the health food industry, was not actually health food. It was more just health marketing. It was starting first from a marketing perspective, saying, hey, here's what we're currently able to do with our cost structure of having to get X or Y margins. And how do we kind of do the minimum viable change to our product such that we can market it? And so I said, well, that's kind of backwards. It feels like, yes, that would have worked maybe 15 years ago, but now we're in an age where people really do care about what they're eating. With the advent of the internet, but I mean, with effectively nutrition influencers being the way they are and being so powerful, you actually have a large audience of people who really does know the details.
Yeah, and I think the science is also accelerating.
Exactly.
Right. I think the epidemiological data, the biochemical physiology data is really just showing that some of the assumptions that we had 15, 20, 30 years ago when we were creating the food pyramid, 50, 100 years ago, that stuff is outdated. So I think so I agree with you. I think there's just a big push. I'm just thinking when you're saying that health marketing versus actual healthy food, it just reminds me of Gatorade. Their big innovation was organic Gatorade. So it's like, okay, you have sugar in your Gatorade product, and now you're going to put organic sugar in there.
Yeah.
And what is the difference between organic glucose and not organic glucose? It's still the same molecule.
Exactly. And then you're going to come up with a really cool, innovative word for salt. You're going to call it electrolytes.
Right.
It's like fantastic. Like I could get my big old Morton's thing of salt, and it'll cost me $3. I mean, that's like the price of, that's like 1/1000th of the price of a Gatorade. So, I mean, I just kind of was like, the market and the industry, in terms of consumer education as well as the knowledge, were both ready for us to kind of create this. And what I soon found was that the food science was not far behind. It still needed some work, and which is what we've done in both of our companies have worked on. But, neither of our companies could have existed 5 years ago, I think, with the actual food technology the way it is.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you couldn't make a ketone ester at the current price without some of the recent developments in terms of how do you synthesize something, chirally pure in a very pure way. So I'm curious if for broader food industry, what do you think are some of those catalysts?
Well, first of all, in our specific case, the big innovation that has needed to happen is the ability to powderize fats with less sugar or carbohydrates attached to them. So for those who are not educated on how the food production of fats happen, which is probably 99% of people, rightfully so, but it's that, fat in general is liquid at room temperature. And so the way that you actually get it into a powder is they effectively atomize it and kind of spray it onto a carbohydrate. So imagine a perfume bottle, that would be an atomizer.
Right.
So this perfume bottle is kind of what they spray really teeny micro droplets onto a field of carbohydrates, and then they allow the two of those to kind of combine just physically, not chemically, and then they drop to the bottom, and that's effectively your powder.
Yep.
The problem is, until only a few years ago, the industry standard was to do that on corn maltodextrin, which is a relatively cheap corn oil, it's a corn carbohydrate,
right.
And it inherently means that for every 1 gram of fat, you have 1 gram of carbohydrate.
Right.
So if you're trying to create something that's like keto, for instance, it's inherently impossible. So what we've done is worked with our individual contract our contract manufacturer as well as our suppliers and our food science team has worked with their food science teams to make, I guess you could say, a powder that's either has less carbohydrates attached to it or has a different substrate, is either fiber, which is effectively 0 net carbs, or protein, which is completely different altogether. So it's that type of innovation that has happened that's really allowed us to have effectively a meal in a bottle that's had low carbs, and specifically it means that the carbs that are in ample are exclusively the carbs that we want to be in ample,
right.
and not just the quote unquote filler that people talk about being in many products.
Yeah.
So that's, from our perspective, I think the biggest thing that has happened.
That's something that we've been thinking a lot about as well in terms of the carriers for fat. And it's just, okay, you have saturated fats, which are basically solid. That's like lard.
Yeah.
You have unsaturated fats, which are oils. And how do you carry that? You're not going to necessarily want to put oil into these ample, bottles necessarily. How do you carry that? And if you can put it on a substrate that's like low glycemic index, like a fiber.
Yeah.
That's like a very smart solution.
You had asked a separate question as well. You said, like, what has happened in the industry that has kind of gotten us to this point? And I'd love to touch base on that.
Let's talk about that. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that anyone listening to your podcast is in their own way an influencer. They have either their own followings or frankly, they're just the excited person in their own personal friend group who knows all this stuff about nutrition.
Not to
and
flatter our
biohacking.
listeners. I think that's actually true. It says like people that are listening to our podcast, which is sizable, but it's not like a Joe Rogan, everyone listening to it. You got to be like the top decile percentage person in your friend group that's like interested in health, performance, metabolism, nutrition. Absolutely.
Exactly. And so what's interesting is that, 20 years ago, all of the information that we got about nutrition and health was basically top down. It was either from the doctor, from the American Medical Association or American Diabetes Association, or, from our doctors who's effectively getting it from the same source, or it's from the government in terms of school, from a food pyramid, or finally from our teaching, which are like school, which is effectively the same thing. So, and then otherwise advertising from like big food or like cereal companies, which is basically telling you the only thing that you want that you're hearing. But of course, now with the internet, that's not the case anymore. You can have someone like yourself or, Mark Sisson or Dave Asprey or Rob Wolf or whoever talk about nutrition in a way that's relatively unbiased, in a way that, that kind of is more of a bottom-up approach. And I think that the big thing that's happening right now is the food industry is really interesting because as opposed to any other CPG business, there's on a yearly basis, something like 17% of the market share from large food companies is getting snapped up by small food companies. And the small food companies like ourselves are actually taking this market share because we're actually listening to the influencers and to the community. And so because these are the people who are now, they have more power than ever. So I think that this is not only exciting for us because we're kind of, as Wayne Gretzky would say, we're skating to where the puck is going, but it's also really exciting because it means that people like listeners have a lot more power and influence over where the food companies are going. And I mean, I would really not underestimate your own power if you're listening to this because like the Campbells, the Kellogg's, the Pepsis of the world 100% are listening and they have to change. And if they don't, they're going to die.
Yeah. You look at Kraft Heinz, their stock just tanked recently because of, essentially speaking towards that same macro trend. Customers are shying away, moving away from these processed foods that are giving you diabetes, metabolic syndrome, all this stuff, and looking at products, foods that are better for them. Yeah. So what do you think are the pillars of what traditional CPG is doing wrong and what companies like yours or what influencers or what scientists are really gravitating towards? I mean, I think on our podcast, we've talked a lot about low carb, reducing refined carbohydrate intake, potentially looking at time-restricted feeding, fasting as strategies, looking at different forms of fat, maybe avoiding polyunsaturated fatty acids for more monounsaturated or other forms of fat. Curious to hear from your perspective, what do you think are some of these big changes or big trends that you're focused on as you look at evolving and creating better foods?
I mean, you touched on basically most of the things that I think about. I think about it kind of from like a mechanistic perspective first. I say, okay, what are a few of the things that really drive human biology? We think gut microbiome, we think inflammation, and hormone response, so like glycemic or insulin response. And effectively, if you can kind of start from that bottoms-up approach that from a fundamental biology or biological perspective, those are things that, although there's still being science that's done, we can be pretty confident that those mechanisms are going to effectively drive the health of an organism, of human beings. Yep. And so then we say, okay, well, what helps out gut microbiome? What helps out reducing inflammation? And honestly, I think that until we address those things that you've just mentioned, I think that we don't even really need to look all that much further. So lowering our refined carbohydrates, I would say a couple things. One is, and I'm less confident on this point, but so I just want to say that as a caveat. What's interesting to me is to see the digestion of carbohydrates and fat together versus carbohydrates or fat on its own. Because it seems like from some of the data that I've seen is that having carbohydrates is not necessarily bad. It's just that our bodies aren't very well adapted at actually metabolizing them at the same time as they metabolize fat. You think about, when would you ever actually have fat and carbohydrates in like the same food in nature? And most of those foods are not actually, they don't really exist in the same form.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, well, not necessarily demonizing carbs entirely, but to say, hey, if we're going to have fat in it, well, let's not have carbohydrates. Now, I will say, of course, that it's probably the case that having a lower carbohydrate diet in general is going to be better for us, specifically because we kind of have seen what having the opposite has done to us in the form of diabetes and metabolic health and everything like that.
No, I think oftentimes in the low carb community, you can go like zero carb maximalist, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Don't avoid carbs at all specific costs. And I think the rational, sensible, evidence-driven person will say, look, carbohydrates have their role.
Yeah.
If you're looking to do a specific sport application or specific application, you're trying to, win a 100-meter race or lift a lot of weights, you probably will want some sugar in your system for maximal performance. But I think most scientists, people that are sensible would agree, just pounding a bunch of sugar,
of course,
probably not optimal. And I think that's an interesting observation around the uniqueness of the standard Western diet, where it is high carb and high fat at the same time, which is like very uniquely, I like to say it's almost uniquely engineered to destroy your metabolism. Well,
so there was this interesting, I forget who it was. I think it was the Landset who a few months ago came out with this study or this large claim that said effectively like low carbohydrate diets are killing us to a certain, that was effectively their claim. And what was interesting, I was talking to Rob Wolf about this, and we were chatting about the fact that they kind of extrapolated, they kind of created this U-shaped curve that said, best life expectancy is in a moderate range, but they extrapolated a curve beyond the data. So in fact, they actually had no studies that actually talked about specifically a ketogenic diet, which is really interesting. They had basically the lowest carbohydrate diet that they actually that they included onto the study was something like 30% of your calories. So it's like, how do you actually make that claim if you're not even studying it? They were sort of just extrapolating it, which is a bummer. But I think also coming back to the individuality of people is really important as well. So for instance, one of the key tenets of Ample was, hey, I truly believe that it's likely the case that low carbohydrates in general are probably better for most people. But should you be exclusively keto? Do you need to be? I don't know. For instance, I can actually still maintain a state of ketosis while having something like 75 grams of carbs a day.
And this is like heavy workout, or are you just ambiently just...
Probably the workout with the working out, but even on days that I don't work out, it still tends to be the case.
Okay, cool.
I guess I'm just lucky like that.
No, I mean, there is definitely variation. You probably have, you have just maybe, I think that's one of the main reasons why people want to build muscle. You have better glucose sinks.
Yeah.
Right? So if you take sugar, it just gets sucked into your muscles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think to kind of get back to your question, to reiterate your points on what are the food industry things that what's wrong with how most food companies are doing it, I would say yes, not actually making a commitment to lower sugar, and I think the jury's still out about sugar alcohols. I don't personally we don't use it in Ample, just because some people have had some digestive distress. I think it's probably fine, but ultimately, we don't really want to risk it, and frankly, we can have a good taste without it. So why put it in there?
Cool.
And then to have, I would say, a spectrum of on the processed versus unprocessed side, try to be on the unprocessed side. And once again, this is a spectrum. I mean, to a certain degree, everything is processed. You cooking your steak is processed.
Right.
You cutting up an apple is technically processed. So ultimately, it's kind of figuring out, hey, for each individual ingredient, what is kind of the ideal state? And then, how do we get close to that perspective? So I think that's kind of the second point. And then I think that the third, like you had mentioned, is there's a decent amount of evidence on the negative effects of polyunsaturated omega-6s. So if we can kind of get away from those, then frankly, I think we can have a really great starting point.
So those are like the three main tenets as you're looking at formulating food.
Yes, I think in general. Obviously, Ample has a specific use case. And so we're like, hey, how do we make an entire meal out of this?
Yeah.
And so we then say, well, we have to have fiber as well. We also have to have a sufficient amount of protein. And carbs can vary, but we also want to have a sufficient amount of fat. And then finally, we want to be able to have to kind of nourish the gut microbiome, we want to have, as we had mentioned, with the fiber comes prebiotics, but we also want to have a probiotic content as well.
Cool.
And so that's kind of where the combination of those specific ingredients comes in.
Let's dive into the macros and then the gut microbiome. I think that's interesting. But before doing that, I think it might be remiss not to ask like maybe a hard question, but I think you mentioned the spectrum of processed to unprocessed.
Yeah.
So obviously this is somewhat processed.
Sure.
Right? Like you don't see these growing in the field or they're running around. So what is your philosophy on, okay, there's some convenience factor obviously here. How do you think about it? I think that is one of the critiques with the processed food industry. And I think that's something that obviously, we have to answer questions about at HVMN as well. So curious to hear your perspective. Obviously there's some processing, and I think you make a good argument that almost every single food that we all consume is processed some level. I think you have some folks arguing, okay, let's only go towards food in the most natural form as possible. How do we reconcile that notion?
I think on one side of the spectrum, processed looks like, I don't know, I'm just going to give an example like a gummy bear or honestly a pretzel or something like that.
Yeah.
What's kind of ironic is ours is a meal replacement. It's a powder in a bottle. You put water in it, you shake it up and drink. And so some people look at that and they're like, oh, well, this isn't food. But then they look at a chip and say, well, that is food, which is really interesting because that's effectively more processed because they effectively start with the same powder that we do. And then they do more processing to actually get it into a chip format or a pretzel format or a cereal format or whatever. And so, of course, having it be the reconstitution and back into a solid phase, I think that's kind of one level beyond where we really want to go. Mm-hmm. I would say that for us, what we've tried to do is I think from the perspective of our oils, and I don't know if you have a different perspective on this, but one thing that I've tried to do is we stay towards non-GMO. And the reason why is not because I think the GMOs are bad. And frankly, I think that there's a big case for GMOs saving the future. However, I do think, though, that the vast majority of the reasons why GMOs right now are being used is not to actually feed more people, but it's effectively as an excuse to just, douse them with more pesticide.
Right. It's a yield economic question more than a health necessarily
exactly.
question.
So, I mean, that's a big thing. So I don't want to get too bogged down in that specific question, but we're saying, okay, until more evidence comes out, saying definitively, totally fine for you. And also, frankly, I don't want to support a company like Monsanto or something like that. And at this moment, that's one of the big things for us. I think another thing for us is to kind of in terms of the oils that we use, we try to stick towards, cold press or effectively things that have a less of a heating or denaturation, standpoint. Same with our proteins. So grass-fed collagen, grass-fed whey, we tend to, and making sure that it's relatively undenatured. Mm-hmm. So that's an important part for us. And then, but I will say as well, like there are times when processing is important. So for instance, like we have pea protein. Many people are like, well, Connor, like peas have lectins. It's true. Peas do have lectins when they are unprocessed.
And what is the meaning of lectins, why they're bad or why people have some concern of them?
Okay, there's good lectins and there's bad lectins, but effectively a lectin it's a part carbohydrate, part protein, and effectively what they can do is they can latch on to the enterocytes, which is effectively the lining of your guts, and they can kind of like pull off or rip off these enterocytes and do damage to them in a similar way that some people worry about gluten. So effectively, lectins can be harmful for people because they'll do damage to the enterocytes and potentially cause or be related to some autoimmunity issues. So once again, those specific lectins. They're not all lectins. Our bodies make lectins as well.
Yeah.
So they're not across the board bad. But people think, okay, so lectins are in peas and a lot of other legumes. What we've done as a society, or I guess as by just the nature of 10,000 years or so of agriculture, what we've done is effectively been soaking beans
in water.
Yeah, you soak them and then you heat them up. So you would never. It would actually be almost deadly to have red kidney beans raw. Like the amount of lectins is like toxic to the human body.
I remember that as a kid, right? Like it's like don't chew these beans.
Yeah.
That is funny. I never thought about it.
Your grandma probably didn't know about the lectins or whatever.
I didn't think about it from a biochemical level. But yeah, I think I just remember it's like, like you just have these beans are like rocks.
Yeah.
You can't really eat them
They
raw.
do taste terrible and you can't really digest them. But, so I think that's one of the things where you have to kind of realize, which is some processing is undesirable. Some processing is literally necessary or you'll die. We obviously invented fire a long time ago and we process food by cooking it. So I think that it's a fine balance, and I hope that we're doing it, well. But once again, like if someone has an issue with how we're doing it, like I would be happy to have that dialogue because once again, we can always improve. Like we will always improve.
Yeah, I think processed and unprocessed is maybe the wrong dimension to really look at. It's maybe orthogonal to what exactly is being input into the system and how it affects your metabolism or how does it affect your physiology, right? Because I think it's like if you have things that are processed, but these are reasonable things that are good substrates for your body, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like something a chemical or something that comes from a living organism, is that inherently better than the other? No, everything's just like a molecule floating around. I think the problem is when you have processed and they have adulterants or rancification or oxidation, that's where the process is really bad.
Yes.
Right? You have a trans fat, which is like a fat that does not exist in nature, and that is a processed thing that makes it more sustainable to be shelf stable. That is bad. But if it's processed, but it's smartly processed where it's actually very, very clean for your body to burn, that's reasonable. So I think maybe one way to change the dialogue is not get overly focused on the processed to unprocessed, but actually think about it from a fueling perspective of how your body processes it, like how it actually breaks it down.
I agree, and I think that there's a book called Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and I think it's a fantastic way to think about it. In his book, what he talks about is effectively there are natural things and there are unnatural things, and it's not necessarily that the unnatural things are inherently bad. It's simply that they need to be validated first, that they need a longer period of time to prove themselves. Like we know, for instance, that we've been eating Brussels sprouts for a really long period of time. And so that seems like a relatively validated way that, okay, if you eat Brussels sprouts, you're probably going to be okay. But if you were to kind of like take all the molecules and kind of reconstitute it into a Brussels sprout imitation, it's plausible that it could be fine.
Right.
In fact, it could be better, but it just needs more validation.
Right.
So I think that's really where we kind of need to get to.
Yeah. I would concede that likely that something that's more natural has a higher probability of being more easily digestible, for example.
Sure.
But that doesn't constrain out everything that's processed is like just bad for you.
Yeah.
I think that's overly strict. So one thing that I think might be helpful to look at specific in the meal replacement industry is that people have, drank Ensures of the world for 20, 30 years. In Silicon Valley, Soylent has been a bit of a phenomenon. I think we know they're, I'm sure you know some of the people there, but I'm, friends with Rob Reinhart, the founder there. What do you think that they don't have right, or how are you thinking about it differently from Ample that changes the meal replacement game?
I don't want to come and bash any of our competitors here. To a certain degree, everyone's doing something right. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business in the first place. Yeah. Where Ample, I feel, where we want to really kind of shine is where, as we talked about with this kind of naturalness of the ingredients, we want to kind of be a little bit more towards the naturalness side of things, in terms of, having grass-fed. If we're going to have an animal product, have it be grass-fed. If we're going to have plant products, let it be non-GMO. And if we're going to get vitamins, let's primarily get those from the actual foods themselves rather than the synthetic vitamins and minerals. And I think what's important for us as well is we have goals and intentions for the product. So for instance, we have a ketogenic version. And so our 400 calorie version has just 3 net grams of carbs per every 400 calories with no sugar alcohols. And so that is intended for a specific use case. It's, hey, I'm trying to eat a low carbohydrate diet. And so effectively, how do I do that with high quality ingredients and really, really quick, time? I only have 30 seconds or a minute to actually prepare or consume this thing. And I need to also constrain my carbohydrates. So that's kind of where we thrive. I think that, we're going after people who really do know that their health is very important to them. They're willing to kind of pay a little bit more, because our product is more expensive than Soylent. It is more expensive than Ensure. I don't think it'll ever get as expensive as those products. But we're really confident in the quality of our ingredients, as well as the targeted macronutrient ratios that we're going for, as well as the additional probiotic nature that helps for the gut microbiome as well. And so I think that's where we're trying to kind of set ourselves apart.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about the macros. So I think we probably unpacked a good amount about fat. One thing that I think we just touched upon, maybe to wrap up the idea on fat, is that you use a high oleic oil.
Yeah.
And can you help unpack that for the audience?
So oleic acid is a monounsaturated fatty acid. And its name is actually derived, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg here, but it's the most predominant one in olive oil. So the names are kind of coming from the same root there. So generally considered a very healthy a healthy monounsaturated fat. And so traditionally what has happened is the sunflower seed has been relatively low oleic. It's been way higher in polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids. And so what has happened though is that there's a couple of suppliers out there who actually want to be able to provide a higher oleic type of option. And so rather than using GMO modification, what they've done is actually they've just done selective breeding over time, in the same way that effectively all breeds of dogs are different through selective breeding. And so they've selectively bred higher and higher amounts of oleic or high oleic acid to the point where it's actually now higher oleic than olive oil and also macadamia nut oil. So in terms of being it's almost, I think, I don't want to quote the exact number, but it's a very small amount of polyunsaturated omega-6, because it's by definition over 85% oleic acid, which is really exciting for us, because it means that, by still kind of having it effectively be this natural form in the sense that it's just selective breeding, we're able to have that same macronutrient profile that we're looking for without having the sort of detrimental inflammatory responses that omega-6s generally have.
So basically, you found a natural way that has selected, you kind of dog bred your way to a high oleic content oil, which is interesting. That's very cool. So we talked a lot about fats. How about your choices in protein? You mentioned you're looking at grass-fed whey.
Yeah.
Maybe help unpack for the audience here. What were some of the considerations that people should think about in general around their protein sources? any specific idea around grass-fed? Is that more marketing speak? Is there some actual benefit from the grass-fed component? What are your thoughts there on the amino acid protein side of the world?
One thing that we think about related to protein decisions are what's called a PDCAS score. Are you familiar with that term?
Well, let's explain to the audience.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So PDCAS is, what is it? It's protein-derived amino acid composition or something like that, or score. So effectively what it is it's a number from 1 to 100 of how complete a protein is. Mm-hmm. And so something with 100, like whey protein or eggs or actually soy as well has a score of 100. In the sense that they're not deficient in any of the 9 essential amino acids. So we have exactly 9 essential amino acids. We have, somewhere in the order of 22, 23 or so amino acids that generally are found in foods. So we don't necessarily need them, but they are beneficial.
Right. And basically the distinction is that essentials are things that you must consume exogenously, where non-essentials your body can produce endogenously.
Exactly. You have to have them because your body can't create them.
Yep.
And by the way, there are essential there are essential amino acids. There are essential fats or fatty acids.
Yep.
There are no essential carbohydrates.
Right.
Which is usually one of the arguments why people are like, oh, you just have to go keto. I think it's a little bit specious of an argument, but I get the point.
Yeah.
So regardless, on the amino acid profiles side of things, what we try to do is to say, so grass-fed whey has a very high PDCAS score, very high in branched chain amino acids as well. So especially if people are trying to work out and have that fast recovery, that's the type of that's the primary protein in our Ample Original and also our Ample K. And so there's that. In Ample Original, we also have grass-fed collagen, which is well known to be very helpful for bone and joint health and skin health as well. So the last protein that we have in Ample Original is pea protein. And so, why pea protein? So one is that it does not have lectins. And the second thing is that, as I was talking about before, how do we get a product that has relatively low relatively low carbohydrates, but still has the fat? Well, what we've actually been able to do is actually have our fat sprayed on that pea protein, which allows us to kind of get our net carbs down, which is really, really interesting.
So the pea protein is almost like a carrier for fat, so you get like double bang.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's product one. We also have egg white protein as well in our Ample K as well, which also has a PDCAS score of 1. And then, the problem though is that some people have issues with either animal protein in general, are either vegan or vegetarian, or like myself, they actually have a little bit of trouble either with the casein or the lactose in grass-fed whey. And so that's why we have Ample V, which is our plant-based version, which effectively combines the amino acids of pea protein as well as rice protein to have a combined PDCAS of 1. So individually, they're incomplete, but when you combine them together, the deficiencies in one make up for the deficiencies in the other. So that's kind of how we're able to kind of have this complete protein in Ample V, which is pretty exciting.
Hey listeners, if you're enjoying this episode thus far, please consider writing a review on our iTunes page. It really does help increase the visibility of our podcast. That's really the best way to support our work. In appreciation for your review, we'll hook you up with $15 of HVMN store credit. We also love it when we see you guys share our episodes that you've enjoyed on your Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And we often reshare those posts. Just tag us at our handle @HVMN. Now back to the show. So I want to follow up and make sure we cover the grass-fed component. Is that
Sure.
Typically people talk about the grass-fed component versus the grain-fed,
Sure.
more from a fatty acid ratio.
Yeah.
Curious from a protein selection, was that a consideration, or is it more of a quality issue where typically grass-fed cows are probably raised in a more high-quality environment? Curious to get your thoughts around that. One, and then two, I want to add a second maybe we'll answer that first. I have a second question related to this. Some of the concerns around soy protein, which could be interesting.
Totally. So a couple things. I totally agree that the vast majority of the issues around grass-fed are around the amino acid composition. I would also say that it's not just the composition, but it's very well documented that the quality of a grain-fed animal's life is just pretty darn bad. And effectively, if you have a lot of toxic stuff that you're ingesting, your body has to store it in fat.
Yeah.
If it's fat soluble. I mean, usually if it's water soluble, your body can just kind of pee it out. But if it's fat soluble, it has to store it in fat. And so that's why I don't really trust the grain-fed fat, because there's a very high likelihood that there's a lot of crap in there that I don't really want to eat.
Do you try to avoid grain-fed cows versus grass-fed cows in terms of steaks? You try to carry that into...
So if I'm actually eating out, and I know it's grain-fed, I'll probably have the leaner cut rather than the fattier cut.
Fair enough, okay.
Yeah. So, and honestly, there's a bajillion other ways I can get my fat, so I'm not really worried about that side of things.
Yeah.
So I would say that's one consideration, but but fair enough, like the quality of the protein, the fact is I simply don't know. But as I had mentioned before about the kind of processing, where I'm saying that the Nassim Nicholas Taleb argument that natural might just require a little bit longer to be validated, or unnatural might require longer to be validated. I just don't yet know what really are the negative ramifications of a grain-fed animal. We know that they just die much quicker than grass-fed. We know that there's toxic stuff in the fat. So for me, although there hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, ever been proven that there's anything bad with the protein, I'd rather just kind of stay on the safe side. So I can't say anything. I really, it could just be marketing. It could just be me staying on the safe side. But, I would say for that reason, as well as just the pure like animal ethic and kind of welfare, I simply want to put my dollars as a food company into the thing that I think is going to be more sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's very reasonable. One of the, I would say, critiques or popular topics of conversation in food consumption is soybeans, and potential estrogenic precursors of consuming too much soy. So I think one of the things that seemed pretty apparent was that you have, in a lot of, meal replacement type products like a Soylent or an Ensure, a lot higher ratios, or they highlight soy oil pretty predominantly.
Yeah.
Curious to get your thoughts around that. So my understanding of the literature is that there is some small but not insignificant increases in estrogen production as you uptake and ramp up increases in soy.
Yeah.
Was that one of the main considerations of why you avoided soy in your products? Any other considerations? I mean, I think on the other hand, soy is a fairly complete protein, as you mentioned. Yeah. So that's kind of the trade-off for soy, tofu. I mean, I think if you are a vegetarian or a vegan, so a good source of protein. And I think a lot of the vegan restaurants, you have a lot of tofu chickens, tofu turkeys. It can be very yummy. But, should we be concerned about the estrogenic properties? What was your consideration there when you avoided soy?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. One is I've read very similar research, which is effectively like there's a relatively mild, probably not super consequential impact in terms of estrogen, but once again, we're just, in this sense going to be staying on the same, on the better safe than sorry type of, idea. So if it does have a potential negative impact, I'd rather not wait 5 or 10 or 15 years until the data comes out and says, hey, it actually did have a negative impact. And, oh, by the way, all your customers are, worse off because of it. I never really want to have that be, in hindsight where we were. So I think, that for number one. Number two, though, is, 99% of soy is GMO. And so it's very difficult to get actually non-GMO soy.
That's okay.
So in fact, the funny thing is, and I've always kind of thought this is silly, which is, and once again, not against GMO inherently. I just want it to be studied really well. But what I was a little bit disappointed with is like in 1997 we started introducing GMO soy into the agriculture system in the U.S. And now it's around 99%. But that was more than 20 years ago, and it's something, and I could be off by about a year or two, but it was something like 2015 when we finally decoded the actual genetics of soy, which is really interesting that like you'd put it out and make it completely ubiquitous in a food supply 20 years before you'd actually understand what its genes are. So to me, that's just a little bit I'm happy for innovation. I just want to go a little bit slower when it comes to our own bodies, and also considering that we can't take back these decisions. Once it's out in the food supply, it's out for good. Like, the agriculture system in the U.S. is now changed for good, and there's nothing we can kind of do about it. So that's kind of why I'm a little bit more on that side of things, because there's no undo button. So I think those are the real two ingredients, or the two ingredients that made up that decision. Of course, we did have to kind of contend with the fact that, as you had mentioned, it's complete. It also tastes pretty good, and from a food science perspective, it's really easy to work with. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really cheap. And one of the last aspect of it is kind of from a fundamental perspective. I don't believe that corn, soy, and wheat should have government subsidies. And I think that that's actually one of the biggest reasons why consumers now are unhealthy, is because for the last however many years, decades, we've been subsidizing these huge commodity crops, beets as well, and sugarcane. And so because of that, it's artificially lowering the price of these things, increasing the supply, and basically making it so easy for large food companies to come around and have really high margins on food products that are unhealthy. And so I don't want to put more dollars into a commodity crop that I feel like is inherently not, I don't think that's either right from a kind of moral perspective, and I don't think it's healthy for us in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good argument for why subsidies have a lot of second order effects that are unpredictable, right? It's like, okay, you're subsidizing corn, which might be good for the Iowan farmers who are farming corn, but then you think of high fructose corn syrup and how that's everywhere in our food supply now because you have so much corn. Okay, well, this is going to be cheaper than any other source of sugar. Yeah. Okay, and I don't think any of the policy decision makers that were like, all right, let's like make this high fructose corn syrup and pump it everywhere.
No one knew.
It's just hard to predict.
Yeah, no one knew, and also no one. I would very much believe that there's no evil players in this food industry. Like, I think one thing that's kind of unfortunate is that we kind of get this, like, both we get fear mongering, but we also get kind of righteous sort of like anger towards either large food companies or the government or the medical system. I could understand how I might kind of be perceived like that. No one's ill-intentioned in this. Like, zero people at least in my personal experience, I've never talked to any of the executives at Pepsi or Kellogg or whatever who just think to themselves, yeah, I really want to make people unhealthy.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just, we've created a system that we didn't understand. Now we're living with the consequences. And fortunately or unfortunately, the system exists now and it perpetuates itself. Like, Pepsi, to not go out of business, still has to sell Pepsi Coke or Pepsi soft drinks.
Yep.
So it's actively trying to move away, but takes time. So, I think it's really important to kind of understand what's wrong, but not, blame or put too much blame or unnecessary hate on individuals for this.
I think that's fair. I think you don't necessarily need to overly demonize, but it is important to raise your voices and try to vote with your dollars per se into
100%.
Buying and supporting businesses or products that you believe in. So it's like, on one hand, let's not create a lynch mob necessarily, but it is important to choose to support vocally and through dollars to make sure you help the companies that you believe in.
Yeah.
And then, so we covered fat, we covered protein. Let's talk about carbohydrates. So we talked about a keto version of Ample, which has lower carbs, but you have the original version and a vegetarian or vegan version?
Yeah, it's both vegan and vegetarian, yes.
Which I presume have carb content. So what are your considerations there? Let's talk about the trade-offs between different forms of carbohydrate.
Sure. All of them actually have a relatively low amount of carbohydrates. So, and I usually quote the 400 calorie meals just because that's more common than the 600 calorie meals in terms of purchasing. But there's around 11 or 12 net grams of carbs per 400 calorie for the Ample Original and also Ample V, our plant-based one. There's 3 net grams for the Ample K. And so what we decided for, we actually changed. We were able to kind of phase out our tapioca. So tapioca dextrin is one of those things that it's better than, in my mind, it's better than corn maltodextrin as a carrier of fat. We had tapioca dextrin originally, but now that we've been able to kind of improve our processing and our process for actually making these fats, we've been able to kind of like have that, that's been taken off the label, which is fantastic. And then the next, the thing that we've kind of replaced it with is some oat flour. And so the oats, whole grain oats, we felt were relatively low glycemic, but still provide, relatively good carbohydrates and are pretty clean. They're gluten-free as well. And then one thing that we also have is we have sweet potato. So we have sweet potato in Ample, well, actually in both Ample V and Ample Original. And so those are quite prevalent in like a decent amount of B vitamins and A vitamins as well. So, and they kind of add a little bit of a flavor to it, which is kind of fun. You probably can't pick it out, but it definitely adds to the flavor.
Got it. So you're looking at lower glycemic carbohydrate sources and looking at, sweet potatoes known to be a little bit more starchy or a little bit more complex than a simple tapioca syrup or something.
Correct, exactly.
So, okay, got it. Cool. That seems very reasonable. And then the last component, which I think is interesting, is the gut microbiome. And obviously that's been, I would say, in conjunction with keto, fasting, probably a third, fourth biggest macro trend of interest in the community of nutrition. It sounds like you've been thoughtful about the prebiotic, probiotic components of that. So can we talk about some of the considerations in Ample that you thought about as you're making it?
Yeah. So I started a CrossFit gym 8 years ago or so. And during our level 1 training program, they their analogy for us for exercise is the black box. And they were like, you know what? Metabolism is freaking complex. Yes. We really don't know exactly what the hell goes on in the human body to make this thing work. What we do know is that we have an input, which is the stress that we put on our body during the workout. We have a black box. It goes into the black box. And then we have the output, which is we get stronger, we get faster, we get, more resilient. Our immune system gets better, we get more healthier, all of these above, right?
Sure. And
so effectively, I think right now it seems as if there's a black box in the gut microbiome space, which is to say that we know I think the only thing that we're relatively confident is that greater diversity of a gut microbiome is generally beneficial. The amount of species that you have is probably a good thing. However, what I think is generally happening with the probiotic space is that we're relatively ignorant of the mechanisms of how they work, but simply that they work. So the kind of current thinking and that I'm aware of, and someone of course can correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but is that effectively probiotics are a transient species. And they're effectively like a flagship species. So the best analogy that we have for this is, let's say this savanna. You have a lion. There's actually a relatively few amount of lions in the savanna for a given population of zebras and, giraffes and everything else.
Yeah.
Plants, wildlife, whatever. But a single pride of lion can make a massive difference on the composition. If you didn't have those, the entire ecosystem would be totally screwed because the gazelle would just run amok. They would eat everything.
Yep. And
then all of a sudden there'd be desolation because there's no more food for, there's no more plants. Similar, so we have a few of these flagship species in environments. And so the popular thought is that although these are transient and, species that once you stop using them, they go out of your system within about 7 days or so. Mm-hmm. on average, they generally tend to solve for gut microbiome diversity, and they generally tend to do things like improve digestive function in the sense that how we actually metabolize our food in the sense that we potentially get more vitamins out of the food that we do consume, and then secondly, they seem to reduce symptoms of gastric distress, like IBS symptoms or flatulence or really whatever else that people are having.
Right.
So ultimately, I think that's kind of the working model, and that's kind of how we used the working model that we used to describe what we put into Ample. And so some of the best strains, or I guess the best genuses, were the Lactobacillus and also the Bifidobacterium genus. What we also, though, had to do is select for strains that were actually relatively resilient to acid. Because, as you know, Ample is in a powder. It's not actually encapsulated into a pill like most probiotics are.
Right.
And so what you need to do is to have it resistant to heat and also resistant to acid, because your acid, in your stomach can get to something like 1 pH.
Yeah, is it going to die in the bottle? Is it going to die in your stomach? You got to be thoughtful
exactly.
about that. Yeah.
So we've selected strains that are kind of inherently very tough. They're very robust and have been shown in clinical studies to be able to get down to that type of pH without being completely killed off. And the other thing that I will mention is that yes, there will be probiotics that actually die off. One thing that we do, and other manufacturers who are trying to do this ethically, is effectively understate the amount of probiotics that are actually in the bottle.
Overdose more, so you make the claim if they die.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly, because we know that over the average shelf life of Ample on the shelf, a certain percent of them will die, and so by the average time that someone consumes the bottle, here's generally where it will be. One of the last strain that's kind of interesting here is a spore-forming bacteria called Bacillus coagulans, and this has actually been pretty well studied as well in terms of having positive effects on both gut microbiome diversity as well as protein absorption and also just reducing like gastric distress. The interesting thing about Bacillus coagulans is that because it's spore forming, effectively means that it's kind of got itself in a shell. And so it actually doesn't, it's almost like a seed pod that doesn't open until it's in the correct spot in your intestines to proliferate. So that's kind of what keeps it from dying.
I think the point that you note was that these are transient organisms, right?
Yeah.
Like if you are fasting for a week, your microbiome's going to look very different from before
100%.
that fast. If you go on a carnivore diet, it's going to shift your microbiome. If you're eating Ample, you're getting another microbiome. So it is this interesting, I think, very dynamic space, like literally dynamic. These things change.
And it changes. It can even change in a matter of a few hours after a meal. So so I think because it's so dynamic, it's funny, when you talk, and I'm sure you've talked to PhDs and researchers in this gut microbiome space, almost none of them is actually willing to kind of make a claim or make a definitive statement about stuff because they're like, further research is necessary. And I totally get it, but it's like there's so much that we don't know yet. But it's really exciting to see that is such a big, sometime in the next 10 years, I'm guessing that the amount of research and knowledge that we have is just going to be fantastic about that space.
What other things have you been, looking at or incorporating in your life personally? Obviously, you founded a CrossFit gym, so I'm sure physical exercise is an important part of your lifestyle. Anything else that's interesting that, for folks that might be more biohackery that are listening? Right now I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor, right? So I can scan my blood sugar ambiently now. Any of those fun things that you're playing around with, or you keep it pretty simple?
100%. And we can call them a biohack because I think that they are 100% a biohack. But I would say that they don't get kind of put into that category. So there's a few things that I do on a daily basis that are like completely essential. And they are actually 3 things. One is I meditate every day for an hour a day. I also do improv comedy once a week. And I think that that's actually fantastic for just incorporating play and kind of having this open awareness, and also to kind of just get completely out of your ego and out of your comfort zone.
That's interesting.
And it's fantastic. And then the last thing is actually, I only lift a couple times a week nowadays. I feel like I'm kind of able to be relatively fit even with just that, because of, I think my body is just kind of used to kind of being in a relatively fit state. So the other days I actually do dance. I do hip hop dance. And the two of those, so improv and dance are phenomenal. They're just so fun. But you can you can look at them from a fun perspective. And I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I don't do that. I don't like, over optimizing for efficiency and everything. I think that the human brain is wired to play. I mean, we play as kids. We play kind of until we have all these stress hormones building up. But it's one of the best, I think, antidotes to living a super cortisol laden life. And so not only is it fantastic for learning a new skill, reducing stress, but it's also, in terms of neuroplasticity of being able to kind of, with your improv, to literally be able to think on the fly and be completely present in the moment. It's just a phenomenal skill to learn.
I mean, I think there's a broader conversation of something that I've been thinking a lot about, is that modern life, modernity has obviously improved longevity, overall life expectancy, except for in the last couple of years in America.
Sure.
But I don't know if people are happier, right? Yeah. And I think it's like we have more money. Our standard of living is better than ever, right? Like all of us, if we have a running toilet, I mean, that's and you have like a place to sleep. You're not homeless, which is not a given in this day and age in America, and especially in San Francisco, where there's a lot of homeless people.
Yeah.
But we're living the lifestyle of kings in the 1400s, right? We have running water, we have warm water, we have light, we can read at night. But it's not clear that people are happy, and I think a lot of it goes back to play. I think a lot of people just are clocking in 9 to 5 and then have their same routine after work, happy hour, and it just becomes this passing of time. You're subsisting to stay alive rather than actually playing, exploring, thinking of new novel things. Yeah. So I think it's like actually nice to hear that you've kind of incorporated this by learning, I guess, hip hop dance. Maybe you've been dancing for a long time. And
I have not. I suck at it. It's fantastic. I'm so bad. And it's like, but it's great to be bad.
I know, it's refreshing to hear. It's very cool.
Like I was really good at CrossFit, but I was like, I'm just not, like, I'm not learning enough anymore. It's not like I'm trying to learn a muscle up for the first time or whatever, which is, I mean, and if you are, it's fantastic. It's a cool experience, but you also need to, have this challenge. And for me, just kind of doing better and lifting more was not the challenge that I wanted. And so I was like, all right, I'll tone that back down. I mean, I'm still doing it, but like just less of it. But then what's a challenge that kind of puts me out of my comfort zone and actually kind of forces me to have courage on a daily basis. Yeah. I think that having that authenticity and the courage is really, really difficult. And I incorporate that on the improv side of things socially, and then also kind of on the kind of dance side of things as well. So to me, they're phenomenal. And like, I'm really excited and I only just started both of them a few months ago, and it's been fantastic.
That's cool. I mean, I think a lot of the people on our program are world champions or Olympians or people just like focus on perfecting their craft. And I guess that might not necessarily be translatable or even practical for people. I like people like myself. I'm not going to be a gold medalist Olympian in anything, but I'm very interested in maximizing my health span, lifespan, and productivity of being what I want to be world class in. So is it reasonable then for folks that want to use exercise or their hobbies as a way to empower their primary craft? Should one be more explorative in terms of pushing their comfort zones? Yeah. Get a learning component into your extracurriculars. If you will.
Exactly. And, you could be a world-class, Olympian level CEO. And so like that's one of those things where that's probably your main focus. And so how do you kind of have your other aspects of your life serve that,
right.
Without, like one thing I love about improv is that it doesn't really take any additional practice. The doing and the practice and the product are the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Same thing with dance. You just do it and that is your practice. And it's also what's fun. Whereas like what I found is like, I could never really get into guitar because although I loved it, the practice was not the same as the product. My practice was doing scales over and over, which is monotonous as hell and just not exciting to me. So that to me is like, I wanted to kind of solve for something that I don't have to really, unless I'm doing it in that moment, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to over optimize. I don't have to plan. I'm just there.
Yeah.
Which allows me to kind of be a lot more present.
Yeah. And I think that's like because we'll reflect on. I think it's like you're present in the moment. I think when you're improving, you're probably thinking about the scene, what clever line you're going to say next. You're in the moment. You're not thinking about
thinking that. You're literally like whatever the hell comes up is what comes up. And it's funny because like you actively try to not even think 10 seconds ahead or not even think 10 seconds behind, which is so hard to do.
Yeah.
Because we're so programmed to kind of be on a time scale. But the funny thing is, whenever we're actually in the zone, we're never thinking on a time scale. We're only ever in the present moment.
Yeah.
So,
which also, I think, goes back to meditation, mindfulness. Obviously, when a lot of people think about meditation, they think about how do you be present, how do you be in the moment.
Yeah.
An hour a day when you wake up, that's...
So I'd love to talk about this.
Yeah.
This is honestly, man, like this is my passion these days. This is, I would say more so my passion than even Ample is to kind of figure out how the hell my brain works, which is so fascinating. I've done a lot of meditation. First of all, I did this thing called the Finder's Course, which is a fantastic thing. Guy named Jeffrey Martin. He basically interviewed about 1,000 enlightened people who like, you just knew they were enlightened from any, either they were Christian, they were Zen, they were Buddhist, doesn't matter. They were just regular people. But then he kind of figured out how they got there. And so it turns out that there's like 16 or 15 different types of meditation that kind of got them to that point. It doesn't really matter if you're actually looking to be enlightened or whatever the hell that means. But just to have more presence, to have less stress, to be more happy, to be more loving and patient and all that stuff. So I did this. It was fantastic. It cost about $2,000 and it was about 2.5 years ago. It was the best $2,000 I ever spent. So you meditate an hour a day and you do a different meditation every week. So, by the end of the 16-week period, you kind of have a sense for what are the meditations that you're good at and not good at, but what work for you. So there's transcendental meditation, there's focusing on your breath, all these things. One of the things though that you think about is they're all effectively awareness meditations. And what that means is like the end goal is that you're devoid of thought, that you're completely in the present. If you're to close your eyes, you're only seeing like a black screen on the other side of your eyelids and there's nothing going on. And that's when, crazy stuff happens or nothing happens and it doesn't really matter, but that's effectively the goal. And so that's kind of one form of meditation. We also think about meditation from the perspective of visualization. There's a lot of people who kind of part of their meditation exists as a visualizing the future, a future state of the world or their life or whatever, or them accomplishing their goals that they want. And that is a form of meditation. There's some woo-woo stuff around like, hey, this is attracting, like the law of attraction and everything like that. And, I honestly am open-minded enough to say, you know what, sure, why not? Like, I don't understand the universe. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything. If that works, fantastic. At the very least, it's a really good way to at least envision how your life is going to be and actually pull yourself towards that and have the positive emotions that kind of like move in that direction. But one thing that I've kind of always been like disappointed with is what the hell happens when you actually have really negative emotions? Like you can be really aware and you can be really positive, but it's all going to be bullshit if you're actually feeling sad or you're actually feeling really stressed. And so the first part of my meditation every day is I basically let every possible negative emotion that I have felt in the last however much time, I have all of that, and I just let it come up. And so what I do is I actually, and it's usually pretty bad, because sometimes it could be something in the last day. Sometimes it could be something that happened 7 years ago that still, it just came up for me. But it turns out it's triggering because otherwise, why would it have come up?
Yeah.
And so what I do is I actually kind of find myself and I allow it to be there, because this is kind of a safe space where I can kind of let these bad emotions be there, or negative, or whatever you want to call them. I let it come up. I just douse it with compassion, and I douse myself. And if it's hard to disidentify with the emotion, then I imagine a little kid in me that's having this negative emotion, because that sort of helps separate me from the negative emotion. I say, okay, well, this kid is having the anger because it's a very normal reason why this kid would have the anger.
Yeah, it's interesting. So are these emotions like something that you regret because you messed up, you made a mistake? Are this emotions where some other person in the world screwed you over or beat you? Are you compassionate to all of that? You're compassionate to yourself when you made that mistake. You're compassionate to the person that's threatening or attacking you. You're compassionate towards the rock in the road that made you trip when you're all of it. You're just compassionate to everything.
It's called either compassion or forgiveness, which is kind of the same side. Yeah. It's like a flip side of the same coin. And I think it's also like to a certain degree like acceptance / faith. And, you don't have to be religious to have the word faith. It can just be like, look, this is going to work out.
Yeah.
However it works out, it's going to work out.
Yeah.
And so you could say, okay, well, that's either acceptance or that's faith or whatever. And so if you can kind of get to that perspective, if you can kind of actively put compassion in the field and it sounds weird, but like literally surround your negative emotion. You can even visualize this surrounding whatever your negative emotion is. Maybe that's a ball, maybe that's this little kid, surround it with the compassion or the positive emotion, and let it be there. Sometimes it might not dissipate for a while, but other times it does. So what's actually funny is that I can kind of identify where in my body I feel these negative emotions. And so like for me, anger comes here in my solar plexus. Sadness comes in my kind of gut area. Some sort of betrayal sometimes comes around my heart area, or some sort of like, desire also comes there too. So I let all these things go. I basically let them, I don't like let them go in a passive sense, but I actually move through them.
So like desire, like jealousy.
Yeah,
so
jealousy.
You would consider that negative. You're like, okay, I wish I had a nice car. I wish I had that person's success.
Hey, Ample, I wish we had done better. I really need to do X amount of revenue next month or next quarter.
Right.
And to say, okay, well, it's cool to act and to do that and to like work towards that, but to have the attachment to that isn't actually necessary.
Right. So you have a compassion around it where it's
I have compassion.
You're going to try as hard as you can, but like I have faith or I have acceptance that the outcome is going to be the outcome. I cannot control it necessarily.
Exactly. I mean, we were talking about, I'm not sure if I was, Tao Te Ching. I think we were talking about right before this meeting. Like I've been listening to that. Like I just read it for the third time, but like that's a, for a relatively type A person, I think it's really nice to kind of have that like little Zen attitude to it. But so like for me, what I do is I go through this process, and I know it's hard for someone who's never even stepped into the, meditation world, for me to talk about all these emotions when most people are like, shit, I only have 2 emotions. I'm either pissed off or I'm not pissed off. Like there are people like that and who don't really have the kind of emotional ability yet to identify with that, right, with them. That's fine. But I found that like it's very, very helpful. And if negative emotions don't come up, if I'm just like, yeah, I'm good today, which is sometimes happens, then that's cool. I can immediately go towards the open awareness or the positive stuff. And hey, you know what? If in the course of my positivity, if all of a sudden I'm thinking in the back of my head, I've got doubt, like, oh no, I can't ever do that. I can't be, this such and such person. Then it's like, I've got some resistance coming up. I have some, I identify it immediately. I'm like, great. I have you, negative emotion. Now I'm going to just douse you and smother you in compassion yet again. And you're going to die. And it's really fun, man. It's like honestly the most fun part of my day.
That's wild. And do you have a timer for the hour, or is this very organic?
It's pretty organic.
You're just
these
like,
days.
you kind of just know, okay, I wake up, I'm going to go into my this meditation area and think through some of these things.
Yeah, sometimes.
And then when you're done, go on with your day. You have an alarm that goes off, and it's an hour.
So it's generally an hour. Sometimes it's a little bit more if I'm dealing with some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Like in the last 5 months or so, I've dealt with a lot of stuff from my kind of middle school and high school era type of, you can call it trauma, whatever you want to call it. But like I've dealt with a lot of stuff that kind of I didn't realize were triggers for me in the now. And so sometimes those come up and I'm like, all right, great. Like we're going to deal with them. But I think having a rough scaffold for how it's going to go and then kind of letting my intuition play off after that. But I think the one thing that has come out of this, and which is really, really important, and I don't think it's trivial at all, is that what's come out of this is like a totally all-pervasive sense of strength and empowerment that like I can deal with kind of anything, because ultimately, no matter what happens, there's a certain subset of emotions. There's shame, there's guilt, there's fear, there's apathy, there's depression, there's sadness, there's anger, there's desire, there's whatever else. There's a handful of them. If you know how to deal with those emotions, no matter what the hell comes up in your life, they're gonna just go through those same trigger points.
Yep.
And if you can just deal with that, it doesn't really matter what happens in your life, and you're gonna be fine no matter what.
Yep.
It's pretty fucking awesome.
Yeah. You just like essentially all possible negative things, you understand how to deal with it.
I literally feel as if I'm like this video game character, and every like, so I'm like, let's say
type of enemy, you figure out the strategy to beat them.
Exactly. And then by beating them, you level up, and then you're like, great, I'm not gonna like let that type of enemy beat me again, because now I used to be level 12, now I'm level 13, and that was a level 12 boss, but now I'm better.
Cool to hear that you essentially have almost done like self-therapy and giving yourself a lot more confidence, awareness.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I do have a therapist, and I go to her every Tuesday. It's Tuesday, so I'm going to see her tonight. It's going to be fantastic. But I would say that like, a lot of people go to, first of all, therapy is very stigmatized even now, and especially for males, even now.
Yeah.
So I mean, definitely not a bad thing, no matter what.
I mean, you're talking about it pretty openly, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I am. I don't think a lot of people would, but like, I would say that, certain times you're going to get stuck. Like there's a couple of emotions right now that I've identified and I'm getting stuck, but it's like, all right, great. Like what's the user manual for the level 12 boss on this particular thing? Like I go to her and be like, yo, I'm struggling with this one. But the difference that's between where I'm kind of coming from and where I think most people come from in terms of their therapy sessions is like, one, they're not doing the work in the middle of the week. Like I'm doing an hour's worth of work every morning. So I have like 7 hours under my belt of working with this stuff before I talk to this therapist. And then like, it's like that's practice where I'm actually kind of I'm working with. But I think the second part of it is like you only talk to a therapist or someone when you're really in a bad state. And you're like, oh man, this is like, I'm really unhappy. Well, that's kind of like going to a doctor only for emergency rooms.
Yeah.
But it's like, you can do that, but what's the preventative side of things? Wouldn't you just want to be really freaking happy with your life? Wouldn't you like really like, because there really is no limit to the amount of happiness that you can have. You just got to work through it. And although, you're talking about, hey, people are not like as happy as they could be, I think it's probably because they're completely okay with being sub-happy.
Or they're not thinking about it. That's something in their control. I think
that's a good point.
Well, I think part of it's like we have so much distraction available at any given point.
Yeah.
Our smartphone, you get your Facebook, your Instagram, you got your Netflix. You can get,
Dude,
you just distract yourself. And I think that might be part of it. We
100%.
never process anything anymore.
And because
you're just completely reactive to what's on your phone.
You're both reactive. And also the problem is like, this is hard shit.
Yeah.
Like, although I say it's a fun part of my day, it's fun because I'm open to the challenge, but it is like, it's kind of like a workout where it's like you feel accomplished after you're done, but it's going to be painful in the time. And you're like, wow, I'm actually going to have to face my demons here.
Right.
And like, there might be some doors in my subconscious mind that I've literally never opened for years.
Right.
What are those doors that I'm going to have to come in and do? And it's much easier to just push them off and say, I don't really need to deal with them. So I can just, I'm just going to kind of put it aside. But I think like for me, I'm like, I really want to take ownership of all of my emotions and my entire life. So it's like, all right, great. Like now I've kind of gotten into the habit of like facing these demons every day.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that the discourse around internal work changes, because I feel like it's only been within the last 2-3 years where this has been discussed in a more serious format.
Yeah.
Where I think 5-10 years ago, you'd been like, dude, you're on some
I know.
Oriental friggin' like you're trying to be some like Buddhist monk or something. And now I think some of the evidence is building up, and I think more and more, I would say, serious people are looking at it as a serious inquiry, right? And I think this is not to say that it's good or bad. I think 100 years ago, if it's like, hey, you're going to a box to like do muscle ups.
Yeah. It's
like why is that person doing that?
Yeah.
And now exercising and working out is very, very sensible.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a time with that mental game.
I'm really hoping so, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. Like I'm really thankful actually that you're giving me the time to talk about this, because like this, as I mentioned, I'm really, really passionate about it. And like, I think that is one of the biggest things that like is missing in our society, especially because it's like, sure, you could be a Buddhist monk, you're talking about, but like also why do I want to do this? Yes, I want to be happy, but I also want to be a freaking successful CEO. Yeah. I can't do that if I don't have my emotions under control.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a big difference between kind of like running on autopilot and really truly facing each day as if like I'm owning it. And so, I just realized like, wow, there were certain times in Ample's past where I was kind of like
reactive.
I was reactive, and I was also kind of I was running on autopilot, almost like, not really excited about stuff. And I'm like, well, that's got to change. How do I get that to change? Yeah. But instead of blaming it, instead of being like, oh crap, like my life's screwed now because, what I thought was my passion is no longer my passion. I'm like, all right, well, maybe I got some stuff underneath all this. Because if there is resistance, it's probably because there's some emotional thing behind it. So let's dive into that and figure it out,
I think this could be its own specific podcast, and we'll probably want to have a deeper conversation around some of our internal explorations there.
Oh man, I'd be so excited about it.
But I want to just, I guess, almost like wrap up, given I think we're going a little bit long here, is that, I like to ask, well, one, we got to learn about, what's upcoming next for the world in Ample. But also one fun question I like to ask is, from more of a scientific lens, if you had infinite resources and subjects and capacity, what kind of clinical research or study would you like to see run? Whether it's Ample related or not Ample related. And then the second part would be, what's new, what's big in 2019 for Ample?
Okay, does this have to be nutrition related?
No.
Okay, great. So I love nutrition, obviously. But I would do I don't exactly have the the study yet in my mind completely identified, but it would be something related to productivity and like ability for someone to really truly work with their emotions, and like if we could tie the lens or tie the dot or connect the dots between actual work productivity and psychological well-being in a really, really definitive way, I think
it's a no-brainer. Everyone would do it.
Everyone would do it, and every company would see how useful and beneficial it is. Like, what's hard for me and for everyone is like, therapy costs money. All these things cost money, and there are certain things that they're just prohibitive to the average person. Yeah. I would want to reduce that barrier for everyone. Yeah, because it's just been so instrumental for me in my life that I think that would be really impactful. So if I had unlimited resources, I would do that. Yeah. And then, of course, your second question, or your first question, what's new with me, or what's new with Ample? We actually just finished up an equity crowdfunding campaign where we had over 1,200 people invest in Ample, the company, for about $800,000, which is really exciting. Yeah, thanks. It was one of the most successful campaigns in equity crowdfunding history, which is really exciting. And so that's what we just finished up. I've just started my own podcast, which we're kind of fiddling with the name here a little bit. So at some point, I would love to have you on as a guest.
Of course.
And then, from a product level, right now we have Ample Original, we have Ample V, which are plant-based, and we have Ample K. In about in less than 2 months or so, and I don't know when this podcast will come out, we're gonna have a bulk version of all of our products come out. So it'll just be a bag with basically 6,000 calories. So that's 15 400-calorie meals. So that's really exciting. And then shortly after that, we're going to be launching chocolate flavors of all of our products, which is really exciting. Bulk packaging and flavors have been the two highest demand, things from our consumers. So we're excited to get those out to people in the next few months.
Cool. So how do people follow along for Ample News? I guess you got Twitter, you got Facebook. Yep. What are the channels? What are the shout outs?
Yeah, so first of all, help@amplemeal.com if you want to email. Of course, just go to amplemeal.com to check out the website and check out the products. We're available on Amazon as well. Just Google Amazon, search Ample on there. And then we're on Instagram @AmpleMeal. We're at Twitter @AmpleMeal. And then we're at /AmpleMeal for Facebook. So we got all those things.
All right, cool. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in this week, everyone. If you want to learn more about HVMN and our offerings, visit www.hvmn.com/pod. Also, by writing a review on our iTunes page and sending a screenshot to podcast@hvmn.com, we'll hook you up with $15 worth of HVMN store credit. Our last shout out goes out to our listener survey, which lets us know who you are better so we can continue making episodes you find most valuable. Visit go.hvmn.com/podcast survey for that survey. It'll only take a few minutes, and new submissions are eligible for an HVMN ketone giveaway. Until next time, eat well, train smart, and live your life.